We shape ourselves to fit this world, and by the world are shaped again. The visible and the invisible working together in common cause to produce the miraculous. I'm thinking of the way the invisible air, travelled at speed round a shaped wing, easily holds our weight. I'm thinking of the way the invisible air, travelled at speed round a shaped wing, easily holds our weight. So may we in this life trust to those elements we have yet to see or imagine, and find the true shape of our own self, by forming it well to the great intangibles about us.
Love the people exactly as they are, and far too much to let them stay that way. I remember the first time I heard those words on my first day of seminary, almost 10 years ago. Sitting in a beautiful stone room with giant stained glass windows, what was now my classroom had been the first chapel on the grounds of Victoria College at the University of Toronto. Love the people exactly as they are, and far too much to let them stay that way. I remember how I bristled at those words, one of the many things in those initial days that made me wonder if I was on the right path, in the right place. I mean, if I love the people exactly as they are, why should I be trying to change them? If I accept them perfect in God's creation, as some of my classmates would come to say, why should I want them to be any different than they are now? And who the heck do these people think they are? That I'm not good enough, that they're going to try and change me. Okay, that last one was a bit of projection, to be sure, a function of my lingering uncertainty about having chosen a progressive Christian seminary for my Master of Divinity. Plus, I mean, if I learned anything from all that time spent sitting in high school hallways, doing the quizzes and reading advice columns in women's magazines of the 90s, it was that it is the fool's path to think that you could change someone you loved. Love the people exactly as they are, and far too much to let them stay that way. I still bristle sometimes when I hear those words, though more often than not, they're coming out of my own mouth now. They sometimes take other forms. We'll meet people exactly where they are, but we aren't going to just leave them there. We'll meet you where you are, but we aren't going to leave you there. Or another way, the acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. Indeed, in our third principle, we are ourselves affirming this intention and this commitment. We are called to accept one another, but we are also committed to growing spiritually, to maturing in our faith, to a change that brings us into deeper relationship with other people and with the Spirit, which is beyond. And we are committed not just to our own spiritual growth, but to growing the Spirit in one another and in our congregations and in our denomination. And it's an uncomfortable notion for many of us. It's an uncomfortable tension, this one. This idea that this congregation exists to affirm me as I am, to see the holy in me, to see the divine character in me, and to tell me so. And to also tell me when I am drifting from that, to name for me those things I cannot yet see for myself, in myself, that are less than what I aspire to, less than what I am committed to. Using an analogy of eyesight, when we perceive our own actions, we see ourselves as though we had one eye with which to gaze. With that one eye, we see what is true from our perspective. The witness of another person or of a whole community is our second eye, the one that gives us the ability to see with depth. It allows us to interpret and to discern where the truth of our perception meets the reality beyond that limited scope. In congregations, we are called to be each other's second eye. At the ordination of a dear friend of mine a few years back, the author and historian Dan McCannon was talking about the nature of our institutions, the commitment our congregations make to one another, in many cases, the very same commitments that we make to one another within them. During his sermon, McCannon lifted up the wisdom of Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom some consider to be one of the fathers of Unitarianism. Though McCannon wonders whether it might be more appropriate to call him an eccentric, wayward uncle to Unitarianism rather than a father. McCannon's allowed to say that kind of thing since he holds the Ralph Waldo Emerson Chair in History at Harvard Divinity School. In his sermon, McCannon was referring to some of what Emerson had written about the essential elements of friendship. And I found myself listening with an ear that asked, are these elements of friendship also elements of being a good congregant? It's strange to read Emerson writing in the patriarchal language of his time, knowing that it's quite likely that it's Margaret Fuller who inspires this writing, whom he regarded as the friend most able to speak truth to him. Emerson writes, the first element of friendship is truth. A friend is a person with whom I may be sincere. Before him I may think aloud. I am arrived at last in the presence of a man so real that I may drop even these undermost garments of dissimulation, courtesy, and second thought, which men never put off, and may deal with him with the simplicity and wholeness with which one chemical atom meets another. A friend is a person in front of whom you can be sincere, a person who can handle your truth, and a person who can tell you the truth. A person who can tell you the truth, tell you when it seems that you're stuck, clinging to a comfort when deep down you know that sometimes the only way to that other side is through the fear, the discomfort, the uncertainty, through the pain, to whatever it is that is beyond. The poet and writer Adrian Rich once lamented, we can count on so few people to go that hard way with us. We can count on so few people to go that hard way with us. In our congregations, we aspire to be these kinds of friends to one another, to be the kind of people who can go the hard way, who can companion people on their own hard ways. My colleague, the Reverend Douglas Taylor, writes, consider the changing landscape of your life. If you are feeling lost or caught or unbalanced or stuck, then spending time in discernment with others will help. Ask yourself, what do I need to be doing? Where is my joy and how am I giving joy to others? Listen for answers in yourself, but listen also to the answers from others. They may see in you what you might not always see in yourself. End quote. Some religious traditions have formal mechanisms for doing this, such as the Quaker practice of the Clearness Committee, or sometimes within the Sangha in Buddhism. In these practices, we are invited to be as honest as we can about something we are struggling with, somewhere that we're stuck or overly attached, some decision we are wrestling with. Some friends meetings have standing clearness committees available for whomever needs them. In others, you are encouraged to form your own, asking people you think could be helpful as reflection partners. If you're asked to serve on one for someone, it is recognized as an honor, and you are committed to say yes, if at all possible. Gathering and gathered with intention. Because in these places and in these spaces, people speak, sometimes appearing to be wrought, appearing to be wrestling with the force of Jacob, who became Israel after wrestling with God in the great Hebrew story. And in these places and in these spaces, people also listen. And in listening, they try to reflect back what they're hearing, and more often than not, also what they're not hearing. And it can be discomforting because it's so unusual in our world, such a rare opportunity. Pierre Wulff, in his book, he's no relation to me, Pierre Wulff. In his book, Discernment, The Art of Choosing Well, he shares a friend's experience with a mature discernment group. He writes, choosing community life, I thought that decisions would be easier. In fact, thanks to my respectful companions, I was invited to assume responsibility for myself at deeper and deeper levels. It was awful to be treated not as a baby, but rather as an adult by people who did not act as mothers, fathers, guardians, parents, or judges, but as my true siblings. It was awful, but beautiful. I fully felt my dignity. It was awful, but beautiful. Have you had that experience? Having had this experience more than once myself, I have a good sense of what Wulff's friend was talking about. Most recently, in my preparations for the interview with the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, I was blessed by colleagues who would read my packet, the 140 some pages detailing my ministerial formation, and they would name for me the places where I was hiding, hoping not to be noticed, the places where I wasn't being accountable for my role in conflicts, the places where I wasn't paying attention to the ways in which my varied identities and my formation in a culture of white supremacy led to behaviors that impacted others in negative ways. The places where my stated values were either not evidenced in practice or were in fact contradicted. It was awful to be treated not as a baby, but rather as an adult by people who did not act as mothers, fathers, parents, guardians, or judges, but as my true siblings. It was awful, but beautiful. I agree with the awful. And after some resistance and reluctance, Ariel calls these my grumpy kitchen rants, and some true wrestling, I know that these insights offered by my colleagues are among the most beautiful gifts I've been offered in my life. This is a gift of our faith as well, that we are honest about this desire, that we are transparent in our desire to encourage folks towards greater spiritual depth, greater spiritual maturity, towards change. That change is a journey we are all on, and it is rarely an easy one. In the language of James Fowler, who wrote one of the foundational books of religious formation called The Stages of Faith, in our changing, in our journey as people of faith, we are maturing, we are deepening, we are reckoning with the truths that cross our artificial boundaries and growing more comfortable with the reality that there are things we cannot know. Our journeys can be seen to be between the stages of faith, but only if we're actually working on it. And we have to do that together. Whether we come through a congregation's doors as adult seekers or grow up in this faith, we are affirmed as we are, certainly. And when we are being the church or the world that we long to see, we are being held to that commitment to become something more. And we are accompanied and witnessed in our wrestling, our striving, our yearning. Having grown up in the congregation served by Reverends Mark and Donna Morrison Reed, what Mark calls the task of religious community is set deep in my bones. He writes in a reading found in our gray hymnals the following: "The central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. It is the church that assures us that we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. The religious community is essential, for alone our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen, and our strength too limited to do all that must be done. Together our vision widens and our strength is renewed." End quote. I was blessed this past week to get to spend some time with the elders of Westside as they reflected on their experiences of friendship. And in their sharing, they widened my vision and I hope found some renewed strength. It was deeply moving to hear folks expressing their gratitude to one another for the ways in which they have felt witnessed, felt accompanied along their own journeys, whether by the congregation or others in their lives, expressing their appreciation for the ways they have been held, the ways they have been nurtured. And it was also moving to hear folks sharing about the loss of those connections and friendships, the smaller and smaller group of people still around who had witnessed their journey. That was a true deep melancholy, and it was accompanied by a knowing silence. And too, there was something, perhaps a lament, from those who had not had those relationships and wonder what life might have been otherwise. How life might have been different, having those people who have been with us throughout, who can be the friend that Emerson extols, with whom we can be our honest selves, and with whom we can speak plainly of how we see them. What might we have lost in not having that type of relationship in our lives? What have we perhaps gained in self-reliance and self-knowledge? What do we want from our lives now, if it is perhaps not too late? One of the things that arose for me in reflecting on that meeting was a further wondering about how we so gratefully and graciously share our appreciation for those who have accompanied us, who have told us hard things we needed to hear, or when lost in our hard times, offered a loving mirror in which we are reminded that we are beloved children of the universe. Like the elders in that group, I come to that gratitude easily myself. And sometimes I have struggled, as so many of us do, with being the one speaking a hard truth. It's an old story, that struggle. One of the blessings of having a little guy in our house, my son Rowan, who's 4 years old, is getting to revisit the fairy tales, parables, and stories of my own childhood, seeing them anew from another perspective, both his perspective as well as this new perspective of my own. Last week, we were reading a book that was an adaptation of The Emperor's New Clothes, and it was a really difficult story to actually explain to a 4-year-old who just keeps asking, but why? Why would they say they saw the fancy fabric if they didn't? Why would the emperor think they were fools if they didn't see it? Why were the scoundrels, he really liked that word, why were the scoundrels lying about their invisible cloth? Why didn't everyone just tell the truth? Why could the kids say it when no one else could? I wonder sometimes whether there is something of the emperor's new clothes in this wrestling we do, struggling to speak the truth when we don't know how it will be received. In the classic story, no one wants to appear the fool, and yet everyone does. Everyone, especially the emperor, needs a new perspective to be offered, needs a friend who can tell the truth. If someone is stuck in one spot, is stuck in one stage of faith, or caught on a hook of what Buddhists call dukkha, the mundane suffering of attachment, how are we accountable for helping them? How are we responsible for their spiritual growth? How are you responsible for your neighbor? What does our third principle, that which we have each affirmed, what does it ask of us? What does it ask of you? I think it asks us to be willing to go the hard way with one another, to be one of the few. I think it asks us to offer a friendship of substance, inviting honesty and offering it in return. I think it asks us to hear voices that make us uncomfortable, that might even make us feel awful. Those voices that help us to see the ways in which our vision is too narrow or our strength too limited, that give us that other perspective, offering the promise of depth, of vision, of the strength necessary to do all that must be done. I think it asks of us that we love one another exactly as we are, and far too much to let us stay that way. I need you, and we need one another. Blessed be. Amen. Ashe.